Hello, everyone. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Art's virtual lunchtime lecture, Creating Reflections on Light. My name is Maria Lopez, and I'm the manager of film and lecture programs at the museum. Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us today. We hope this lecture serves as a preview to our exhibition, Reflections on Light, works from the NCMA Collection, which is now on view at the NCMA until February 14, 2021. Before we begin with the lecture, I'd just like to give everyone an overview of the agenda for today. This virtual lecture will last about 1 hour. Our lecturer today, Michele Frederick, the Associate Curator of European Art at the NCMA, will present, and then we will have a short Q&A session where we will share your questions with Michele. Please enter your questions using the Q&A function or the chat box. I also want to let everyone know that this conversation will be recorded and made available on the NCMA YouTube page. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the NC Museum of Art's Associate Curator of European Art, Michele Frederick. Welcome, Michele.
Thanks, Maria. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here and happy that all of you are joining to hear about this exhibition. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see, hopefully, my PowerPoint. And I am going to talk for about 40 minutes. I'm going to kind of really keep myself to a timer, or not a timer. I'm going to keep track of my time so that I don't kind of go far over, so we can have plenty of time to kind of address any questions you might have in the end. So again, I'm Michele. I'm Associate Curator of European Art at the NCMA. A little bit about me. This picture makes me very nostalgic for when we could gather in the museum in groups with no masks. And I got my PhD from the University of Delaware and worked at several museums before coming to the NCMA in August of last year. So I'm pretty new to the institution. And it's a very exciting time to be at the NCMA because we have a lot of changes with our new director, Valerie Hillings, including this exciting exhibition program, part of which I'm going to share with you. So we're here to talk about this show, which you can see kind of zoomed out views of. It's on either side of the main kind of avenue on our exhibition level in our older building, our East building. And this really came about more than a year ago. This kind of concept was put forth basically my first day on the job. And here's some like facts and figures. I won't be kind of reading everything, but the theme of the show, light, which is very broad, was brought up because it is the 10th anniversary this year in 2020 of the West Building. So our newer building, which was opened in 2010 as designed to have all of these skylights, white walls, light floors, to have this kind of expansive experience of art in natural light. And so we thought, you know, how else has light inspired artists in our collection throughout time? And this exhibition is partially funded through the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, which awarded the NCMA a grant to support an ongoing reinstallation of our collection. So this is planned for 2022. And the grant also supports 3 collection-based exhibitions for 3 years, so 9 exhibitions in total, which is helping us to kind of re-envision our collection. So the 3 shows for this year are all on view right now, and they include my exhibition, Reflections on Light, Miracle on Morgan Street, which is about the museum's history, and West Building and the Architecture of Light, which is about the architecture of our West Building and how it uses light. So in my exhibition and in several of these exhibitions, objects from all curatorial areas and parts of the collection are featured. So this allows us to kind of break down the barriers that exist between, you know, say European and American or contemporary and historic materials to put together stuff from different time periods and geographies and media to have a more collaborative approach to how we're kind of showing our history, showing our collection and investigating it at the same time. So if you've been to the museum recently, you might have noticed some kind of interesting pairings that have been going on in both buildings. This is really part of the spirit behind the grant, this mixing up of our collection and the way that we present it, and it's called the Interchanges Program. And this is really a pilot for not only these collection-based shows like the light exhibition, but also how we are hoping to present our collection going forward in the reinstallation. So you see here, I hope you can see my cursor, contemporary portraits like this Kehinde Wiley and this Amy Sherrill paired with historic portraits. So re-examining how we think of portraiture and what it can do. Contemporary or modern landscapes with, old masters and so on. So this is really the driving force behind how we're hoping to present our collection more going forward. And so to the exhibition, I'm going to start with some behind the scenes things. So this show from kind of concept to opening day took more than a year. This is a relatively small show, so it goes to show you how much planning has to go into even a small show that is only our collection objects. So every single exhibition starts with a checklist like this one, which is just, a boring Excel spreadsheet where we put in everything that will go in the show, we number it, we categorize it, so we have all the information at hand. So this is part of a partial view of the one for the light exhibition. And then once the checklist is kind of more or less set, we work with our exhibition designers to create a floor plan. So here you see the galleries, the two kind of triangle shapes on either side of this main hall, and we lay out the works to scale to kind of see what will fit where, what we have to rearrange. Usually the checklists have much more stuff on them than can ever fit in the exhibition space. And so working with our designers and these floor plans really helps us to refine the look of an exhibition. Then it's 2020, and this exhibition plan was set in February. And then of course we all know what happened in March. Everything fell apart and we closed to the public. So not just this exhibition and not just our museum, but every museum and every exhibition that was planned for 2020 had to reevaluate what they were doing, when they could open, how to go forward with an unknown opening date. So we didn't know when we would open to the public. We didn't know how long this kind of closure would last, how comfortable people would be coming. So every complication you can have in planning an exhibition happened in 2020. So the advantage of this being a collection-based show is that everything was already in the building. So we already own all of this. We didn't have to work with lenders and delay things like that. So it was much more logistically easy. But the disadvantage is that we do actively lend our collection. So one of our works, our Monet landscape here, was in Germany on exhibition, and the museums in Germany closed and it was stuck there, and we weren't sure if it would make it back for the exhibition. So we had to have like a plan B and a plan C in case the painting didn't make it back in time. Luckily it did. So normally when a work is lent to a foreign institution or even a domestic one that's not ours, we send a member of our conservation staff or our registration staff to travel with the painting or the object. They're called a courier. And so when it's a conservator, they're really there to kind of check the condition of the work before it gets shipped and once it arrives. And so the same goes for when it's coming back. So normally a member of our staff would go and inspect the work before it comes off the wall of this museum in Germany, and then reevaluate it once it comes back as well. That couldn't happen, especially in July, which is when the German museums were finally open enough to allow the work to be shipped back to us. So we couldn't travel, they couldn't travel. So we did a virtual condition report. So what you see here are two colleagues who work at this museum in Germany, in Potsdam, and they have a kind of virtual condition report happening with one of our conservators here on the screen. So because we were all very flexible with letting these things happen virtually instead of in person like they normally are done, we were able to get the work back in time, and it is installed in the show. And if you have been to the exhibition, keen visitors might have noticed that this is the only painting with glass. It's called Glazing. And this is because this is required by most European museums. When we lend paintings, they require some glass for the protection of the painting, like from visitors. In most European museums, paintings have glass in front of them. And we didn't have time to remove it before the show opens, which normally we would do. So we have like a little remnant of the fact that this was stuck in Europe during the kind of height of the COVID crisis there. And so once you have all the works in place, you start installing, you paint the walls, stuff is everywhere, art is leaning on blocks, and objects are brought in on carts. And you can see we have, these are excerpts from the floor plan. So our designer made each, an elevation of each wall so that our art handlers, which is who handles all the art, the people responsible for installing it on the walls, so they know what goes where. And so it looks like this until it doesn't, and it's very well put together. And I think that even, so in this shot, you can see the difference that lighting makes. So this is before it's lit, all the lights are on, nothing's set to a specific object. And then once it's done, it's much more kind of moody and dramatic. And so our lighting designers also do just such an incredible job with that. So that's kind of a broad overview of the process of putting together the exhibition and the challenges that came with it, in particular this year. You know, what otherwise would have been a relatively simple show, all works from our collection, just moving, you know, mostly from the West Building into the East Building or from storage to be put together, became a real juggling act of, you know, how many staff we could have on site at one time, when we might open, you know, all our schedules were slowed down. And so this show was well positioned in some ways to respond to that. And it is small, so it's manageable. Our bigger exhibitions that are on view right now were a much bigger challenge, especially logistically for all of our staff. But we managed to get this exhibition installed in time, and it opened the day that we opened to the public on September 9th. So I've been really happy with the response from people who have seen it in person so far. So that's been really great. We're really lucky that this was able to open on time when we opened back up to the public. So with that, I'm gonna show some highlights from the show. And like I said, it's pretty small, but it takes up, you know, a significant floor space here. So just an overview, it's organized in 3 sections, and the broad theme is how artists throughout time and from diverse cultural contexts have been inspired by or used light as a tool of artistic expression and human innovation. So there are 3 sections: harnessing light, drawing with light, and seeing with light. And I'm gonna kind of go over what I mean by these and show a few examples from each section. And just to emphasize, this features 35 objects only, but they come from 16 countries and they cover 2,500 years of art history. And it's all just from the NCMA's collection, which is pretty remarkable. So the first section, a view of what you see here, is called harnessing light. This is really the broadest category. Throughout time, even you can see, you know, in modern painting and ancient oil lamps, and we have contemporary photography in this section as well. Light was inspirational to artists and to people really pushing the boundaries of human achievement and artistic expression. In the Middle Ages and earlier and after, light was often symbolic of knowledge, of the afterlife, or divine presence. And really, it's one of the most potent elements to symbolize the world around us and how we engage with it, how artists represent it. It's a really malleable element, and clearly, artists have been inspired by light for thousands of years. And so, capturing light or harnessing light was vital for every artist featured in the exhibition. And just some of the materials that are used to do this, we have paint, ceramic, glass, gold, silver, and brass. So regardless of the material, light is there. And in the ancient world, light is essential for the production of art. So not until electric light really proliferates, it's human activity was confined to the daytime hours. The quality of light dropped so precipitously, even with gas lamps in the 19th century. So it's not until relatively recently that we can really exist and be productive after the sun sets. So light is a really essential thing. And in the 17th century, around there, artist studios were often oriented so that they could get the best natural light, and a lot of them only painted during the daytime. So it's a really defining element. And so I'm gonna go, here are some more installation views. So you can see it's a real breadth of objects in this section of harnessing light. And so the first one, kind of in this little niche here, when you first come into the exhibition, is a 16th century Flemish painting depicting Salvator Mundi, or Christ as the savior of the world. And here we have real gold in the background, and the artist's skill really is competing with this actual gold, which catches the light. It's very shimmery and reflective, but here we have fictive gold, which is painted in these elaborate filigree patterns. And so in this period, as painting, especially in Northern Europe, which is where this was produced, becomes more and more realistic, it really changes the way that gold in paintings like this is perceived. So for hundreds of years before this painting was made, gold was used to symbolize the space of heaven. It's a literal kind of heavenly glow. And so here, Christ is meant to exist in a space apart from us. He is in the heavenly realm. We cannot access him. And yet, this highly realistic oil paint makes him look like he's in our space. All the perspective is making it seem like, this brooch is projecting forward to us. There's light glinting off his eyes, and so on, so that he looks very realistic. And the kind of clincher in this is this gold glass orb that he holds, which reflects not only his hand, but the view outside the artist's window. So we see a cityscape with a church and a spire here, which is very 16th century. So Christ in this painting exists in heaven, yet he exists in our space. And in the present day to when this painting was made. So it's really striking, a totally new development in painting to make something this realistic. So next, we have this photograph by MJ Sharp, who is here, and I hope I will do justice to this photograph. MJ was nice enough to share her memory of the night of making this photo. So I'll read a little bit of this, but the main, I think, surprise of this is that this was taken in the middle of the night. This photograph was taken in complete darkness. The brightness of the light almost makes it seem like it's dawn, but it is not. It's the middle of the night. And so these photographs really emphasize the light that exists in the darkness. This was done using a long exposure, so it captures all of the atmospheric light. This is mostly from the moon in this case, because as MJ knows, this was done outside of Amarillo, so you don't get the light pollution from the city to the extent that you might be used to. And so I'm going to share a little bit from the artist. So this was taken in May of 2006, and it was done on a stop on a road trip from LA back to the East Coast, where MJ was helping a friend move. So on the third night of this trip, they were moving into Texas, and she had only a small camera bag, and they'd agreed to kind of get this trip over with and only stop to shoot a photograph if the opportunity presented itself. So this was done at the last exit before Amarillo. As I mentioned, there was none of the kind of light pollution from the city. It was so dark that she was having trouble focusing on the silo and at one point, a highway patrol officer came to investigate what was going on at this kind of otherwise abandoned exit. And he ended up pointing his patrol car's spotlight at the silo so that she could get her final focus and help frame up the photograph. Sorry, accidental advance of slide there. And so MJ shared kind of at length her struggle with taking this photo in almost complete darkness and her process. And so I'm going to read a little bit of that because I work on historic paintings and I almost never get to kind of hear and share exactly what the artist was thinking and doing and working toward as they were making their image. So I'm going to read a little bit. So when we exited, it seemed clear that there was no light at that exit. The only structures there were those in the photo. It was likely sometime between 10 and midnight. I do remember how continually frustrating it was in terms of the exposure. The moon that night was full, or mostly so, and when it was out, it was pretty bright. But clouds kept coming through and covering that bright moon. Illumination of a scene by a full moon in a clear sky is one kind of exposure. Illumination of a scene by a moon socked in by cloud cover is a very different kind of exposure. I remember realizing I was going to need to change the exposure on the shot several times. It played out like this. Oh, good, no clouds, maybe 15 more minutes. No, heavy cloud cover, now at least 30 minutes more. That went back and forth, went on throughout the entire exposure. Of course, now I'm really glad for all that cloud cover in the picture because the moon's movement and the cloud cover gently illuminated by that moon from behind makes for a very different picture than would have resulted from a clear night scene. I'm so happy to have such a detailed account of the night that this photograph was taken. And despite the kind of arduous process, I love this photograph so much because it really emphasizes if you are patient and kind of look for specific kinds of light, that there really is a lot of light that exists in the darkness. It captures it so well in this photograph. And I think that's a message that I've been kind of happy to have and communicate in this really dark year, that there is light that exists in the darkness. So thank you again to MJ for sharing that. And I'm going to try to not speed through, but go a little more quickly so that I can make sure you get a broad overview of the show. So here is an 18th century painting of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which is one of the most dramatic pictures in the show. And Mount Vesuvius, of course, some of you may know, is famous for destroying the ancient city of Pompeii, and that was in antiquity. In the 18th century, Naples, which sits just in the shadow of Vesuvius, was becoming a tourist destination. Tourism is kind of invented in the 18th century. And this volcano, Vesuvius, which was already famous for the destruction of Pompeii, continued to erupt throughout the 18th century. And so here, the artist, who is French but working in Naples, is painting one such eruption that he himself witnessed a few years before making this painting. So this is not an ancient scene or a scene from ancient history. This is all 18th century, carriages, costumes, ships. And what I love about this is we have this beautiful silvery moon with the bright reflections on the water, but nothing can compare to this horrifying explosion of fire and ash and the lava flow that leads horrifyingly down toward this seaside village, and the torchlight that brings our eye kind of across the foreground through the panic of these people experiencing this kind of midnight explosion of fire. So a really dramatic approach to light there. Next to the volaire, instead of a moonlight, we have a sunset. And the Impressionists, of which Monet is the most well-known member, are really the painters of light extraordinaire. They're probably the most famous example of artists being captivated by light. And it's a similar scene of a sunrise painted a few years before by Monet and exhibited that gave the movement Impressionism its name. And what I think is fascinating and probably surprising to some fans of Monet, since he is such a household name now to us today, when his works were exhibited, they were universally hated by critics. The one who coined the term Impressionism was insulting him. He was saying, this is an impression, it's not a finished painting. So look how highly finished something like the Volaire is versus these really unblended sketch-like strokes of paint that are so effective in giving this glittering sense of sunset in winter, which is when this was painted. And particularly good, if you can come to see this work in person, is the thick kind of circular stroke of paint in the sun. Really beautifully captured. Okay, so throughout we're going to kind of be jumping forward and backwards in history. So now we're going back to the 17th century. And in this painting, we see a beautiful demonstration of a really important principle in the 17th century, which is called Reflexikunst, or the art of reflection. I think it's pretty self-explanatory where this kind of term comes from in a still life like this. But basically, the driving force of 17th century Dutch paintings like this one is to make the work look three-dimensional. And this is achieved through these highly complex, multifaceted reflections. So here you see this goblet reflected in the jug, which reflects a window, which reflects this glass, which in turn reflects a window and refracts the pewter and casts a reflection on this white tablecloth. This overturned vessel is reflected in this plate, which goes over the edge of the table and casts a shadow from the light source that's hidden up here. And so all of this together works very strongly. Sorry, my mouse is very sensitive, so I keep going back and forth. Works very strongly to make the elements on this table look like they're kind of jutting out towards you. Here we have an illumination. So this would have been a capital letter of the first word of this canticle or song from the 15th century. And illuminations get their name from the use of real gold, which we see in the border here and in the halos of the little figures. And similar to the Massus Salvator Mundi that we started with, gold really symbolizes the space of heaven and otherworldly space, and is the reason we call these kinds of illustrations illuminations. So also at the NCMA, we have a large and important collection of ancient American art. One of those is represented in the show in the form of this incense burner lid. So this takes the form of a deceased warrior, and it has stylized butterflies, flames, birds, and flowers. And together, these symbolize the flower mountain, which was a kind of paradise afterlife. And that was accessed by the cremation of remains. So this is symbolizing what the goal of burnt offerings, which it would have been placed on. And there's a chimney in the back of this piece. You can see a little bit of it here. And so smoke would have come out from behind and created a really multi-sensory experience. We also have a selection of ancient Roman oil lamps in the show. As I mentioned at the beginning, lamps in the ancient world were essential to kind of push human activity into the nighttime hours. Here we have one in the shape of an actor's head, and this is actually a lamp holder. So a smaller lamp would have been inserted into this, and it would have glowed like a jack-o'-lantern, which is why I really love this view here. We have a feeder vase, which would have been full of oil in order to kind of fill these smaller lamps with oil they needed to keep burning. And we also have a glass lamp, which would have offered multi-directional light and is a real alternative to the usually more simple terracotta or ceramic lamps that we have from the ancient world. We also have a very large Judaic collection here at the NCMA, and we are so happy to feature a work from that collection in the light show, the standing Hanukkah lamp. Hanukkah, of course, is also known as the Festival of Lights and is going on right now. I think it ends tomorrow. And it celebrates this ancient miracle of a one-day supply of lamp oil burning for 8 days. And as a fun fact, this Hanukkah lamp in 2015 was chosen as the menorah for the national celebrations of Hanukkah in DC. And that year it went there and was lit by the President of Israel and President Obama. So we're really honored by that as well. We also have African arts in our show. Most of them come from West and Central Africa. This is a beaded crown from by a Yoruba artist in Nigeria. And in Yoruba art, beads are considered points of light. I think it's easy for us to, in the West, to look at something like this and not see it as full of light as much as some other examples. It's not as reflective as a mirror or hammered brass, but for the Yoruba, beads transform and are transformed by light as it's reflected off of them. So they're a really prized object, which is why they're adorning in intricate patterns this crown for the king or the Ade of Yoruba, or the Oba of Yoruba. We also have the soul washers badge made by the Fante in Ghana. So gilded objects, just like the Western traditions using real gold that we've looked at already. Gold is reflective, it communicates power, it's very valuable. And for the Fante who produced this, it also represents the soul. And so this was worn by the soul washer, which is a member of the ruler's court responsible for purification rituals as well. And so this not only is valuable in the material, but valuable in what it symbolizes to the Fante. So I lingered a lot on the painting. Sorry, that's my bias. So moving to the second section, we have drawing with light. And what I mean by that is how photographs, when they were kind of invented and marketed in the early 19th century as a new technology, how they were talked about. So in the first publication that had commercially printed photographs and photographic illustrations, these pictures were talked about as sun pictures, as being pictures drawn with light, and not that they're engravings or prints after a scene from nature. So this sense of photography as being kind of an unmediated view of the world, a direct view of nature, was really key to early photography and is a hallmark of how artists, I think, still continue to interact with photography and the play of light that it allows. So here are some installation views. And so one of the earliest photographic types is the Daguerreotype, which is a unique print. So there are no multiples of this image. And it's really somber, a lot of these early photographs. And that's because they took a long time to expose. The technology wasn't very advanced. So it could take anywhere from a few minutes to, 30 minutes. And which is why most of the subjects aren't smiling. It could even involve like a clamp that goes behind your head to hold it in place. Because if you move at all, really, during that exposure time, you'll be blurry and out of focus. So especially with children, holding them still and not smiling were essential. And the image is affixed to a sheet of silver plated copper, which is why it looks kind of holographic now as it's aging. This could tarnish really easily. And so you tend to see them in elaborate cases that will protect them from scratching and the air as much as possible. In this case, we have velvet and leather in the case. So photograph is documentation. We have this beautiful example by Carlton Watkins called The Best General View. And this is what Watkins himself titled the photograph. This work was commissioned by the California Geographical Survey and captures what he felt were the most important features of Yosemite Valley, including the famous waterfall, Bridalveil Fall, right here at the center. And just to, we could take a photograph like this with our phone, but for Watkins, it was done with a large glass plate negative. And this expedition resulted in about 100 photographs, and it required 2,000 pounds of equipment and more than 6 mules in a train to carry. So how far technology has come. I'm going to advance a little bit. Chris McCaw is a contemporary photographer who's really interested in light as the subject and a participant in his photography. So in this case, he does long exposures, a technique he discovered by accident while falling asleep while he was trying to take a photograph. And the exposure time means that the sun has burned a hole into this unique negative. So this is light sensitive paper that's exposed for such a long time that light itself has become a physical agent and drilled through. So it's just so beautiful and appropriate for the exhibition. This work by Maria Martinez Cañas is called a photogram. It is a photo made without a camera. So this is a process very similar to how architects make blueprints. They will take a sheet of light sensitive paper and put objects on it and then expose it to light. It can be as simple as taking it outside. You could use an artificial light. And so it really records the gesture of the artist placing things on this paper. In this case, we have lots of natural forms. We have rocks, a bird, grass, and it leads to a kind of soft focus that makes me think always that this is a seascape, and that I'm looking at kind of a jellyfish as I sink beneath the waves. So it's very mysterious and almost eerie. So the third section comes into the contemporary museum practice realm. Seeing with light is about how we meaning my colleagues in conservation, use light to see into our collection, into their history. So we see beneath the layers of a painting and into the kind of cracks and crevices of our objects. And so here's an installation view of that. And so I think this is the last one I'll linger on, although there's 2 other examples if you're curious, but just because this is the one I know the best. So this is a 16th century Dutch painting. And here's the painting. What we're looking at here is its IR, or infrared reflectogram. And that means that we're using infrared light, which is just beyond what we can see with the human eye. So here's our visible light spectrum, the rainbow, and here's the IR range. And we're looking beneath the upper layers of the paint to see what lies beneath. And in this case, that's an underdrawing. This kind of painting is particularly well suited to being examined with IR because it's made on a wood panel. Wood is very rough and bumpy. So this was prepared with a white, usually chalk ground layer to kind of fill in the bumps, give you a really nice smooth surface to paint on. Then the artist and his studio would have drawn a preliminary drawing, sketching out what goes where, what shadows are deep and what are shallow. And this would have been done with a carbon-based material in this period, usually charcoal or something like that. And IR, its wavelength is particularly well suited to this because it's reflected very strongly off this white ground layer and absorbed very strongly by this carbon drawing material. So what you see is a clear contrasting image of what's beneath the painting. So here, I hope you can see little parallel lines here in the cloak. These are all drawn underneath, indicating shadows. Every element of the architecture was drawn in advance in order to help the artist's studio assistants, most likely, to follow it as they're working up the layers. And what IR can also do is to help us confirm the authenticity of a painting, the authorship of a painting, and also see what, if anything, changed as the painting was being made. Usually it's very subtle, like a hand or a head tilts, and so the eyes in IR are in a different place. So this really helps us to look back in time and beneath the layers of paint. And we do other things like UV, which is here, and VIL, which also uses the IR spectrum to detect certain types of pigments, which is what's glowing. And so that's a very quick overview. I am not a conservator because I want to make sure, I think we're just about at 40 minutes, and I want to make sure I get to questions. So that's a very quick overview of the Reflections on Light exhibition, which I hope that you all, if you haven't and you're local to the area, will be able to come and see in person. And I'm going to stop my screen share so that we can kind of look at questions. And I can always bring back up my PowerPoint if we really need.
Thank you, Michelle. So we did get a couple of questions. We got a question from Jen Rokowski. I love the works in this exhibition. How were you able to explore the collection, especially new to the NCMA, and discover their connections to light for the show?
Well, that's a great question. So yeah, it was a really good opportunity for me as a new curator at the museum to not only, like, I'm in charge of part of the European collection, so I was getting to know my own collection at the same time as kind of branching into all of my colleagues' collections as well. So I started in like a really boring fashion of going through our collection database. So we have a database that has a kind of entry for every object in our collection. And I was just like I went through every photograph we have to see what really captured light in an interesting way or grabbed my attention. And so I kind of just went collection by collection. I obviously looked at what's on view, but in most museums, that's a fraction of what we have. And so looking through storage, looking through our database, I slowly pieced things together. And in the real struggle was to make such a broad swath of objects coherent together. And so finding ways to group them and subgroup them was a real process. And that's part of why the planning takes so long, is to really hone down what you want to show and what works well together. Takes just a long time, especially if you're new and don't know anything about the collection. So it was a long process.
Okay, we also got a question from Donna Thrasher. Any idea why MJ Sharp felt that exit was ripe for a photo? Why there? Why then? She is aware that perhaps you said it, but she missed it.
Yeah, so MJ, shared a little bit with me. And so from what I can gather, it was kind of just a feeling that she and her friend both had. You know, she's interested in capturing the light in darkness, so that eliminates any kind of light filled things as you're driving along. And I think it was just an instinct of, okay, this looks like it could be just really abandoned, right? And it could be ripe for this kind of photograph, focusing on something neglected or something where there's no one around, no visible activity. And so I think it's a connection, or a balance between inspiration and instinct and luck, because you know those two things have to come together at the same time in order to create magic like you have in the photograph. But I am also not an artist, so that's just my my guess and assumption based on what MJ so generously shared.
And we do have one more question, and it is, actually, no, we just got another one, but I'll read this one. Why does a Diazo print necessarily need to have a background hue similar to an architectural blueprint?
It it's something to do with the chemicals that make the paper light sensitive and help to fix the image. So it's that's why they're called blueprints. That's just the kind of tone that the chemical reactions cause in the paper. I believe, I'm also not a photo historian. That's part of the fun of working on such a broad swath of things. Like, I'm far afield from my area of expertise, and so I have some knowledge, but certainly not everything. So some members of the audience might know more about photographic processes than I do in some cases. So I don't think that the tone of kind of purple or blue is, in this case, it's an artistic choice because you know it's going to be purple-ish, and how much you expose it to the light determines the tone of purple. But I think that the actual color is down to the chemicals. But I could be wrong. That's just my understanding of it.
And we just got one more question, and it is from Cindy Freeman. Was there any piece of art you wanted to include in the exhibit but couldn't? Why or why not?
Ooh, that's a good question. I was lucky that I worked with our designers right from the beginning to make sure I wasn't being too unreasonable with the amount of stuff I was trying to fit in these galleries. So there wasn't a ton of, we want 10 things to fit, and they just won't. And we're lucky in that it's all our collection. So my colleagues in other curatorial departments were very generous in saying, oh yeah, of course you can, move that to the other building and put it in your show. And so we didn't have someone saying, no, absolutely, you can't borrow this from our museum. So that's usually when curators have an object they wish had been in the show. That's usually what happens. The museum, for whatever reason, can't lend it. So we didn't have much of that going on here. I would have loved to have a few more kind of objects in cases, but there's just not a lot of floor space in the show. And so there's a lot of objects in cases in the first section, all the African objects, the Hanukkah lamp, the incense burner, and all the oil lamps. And that was really the max we could fit. And so I wish that if we had the space in this particular area of the museum to have even more of a balance between 2D things and 3-dimensional things. Because I'm a paintings expert and most of my collection is paintings, I'm always very aware of not overemphasizing that. Like, not all art is paintings or photographs. A lot of it is objects and sculptures. And so there were a few things that just we couldn't fit because we couldn't fit enough pedestals. But overall, I think we were all pleasantly surprised by the amount of stuff we kind of jammed in. It doesn't feel jammed, but it's quite full, both of these galleries.
And we just got another question from MJ Sharp. This was great. Thanks so much. Quick question. In pulling together this show, did you get ideas for what you want to do next?
Great question. Thanks, MJ. So I think that there'll definitely be more of these shows coming down the pipeline. In our reinstallation, we're hoping to feature more thematic things like this. Really, I think it's safe to say that in the curatorial department here at the NCMA, we're really looking to our permanent collection as less permanent and more of an exhibition, an opportunity for exhibitions. So we can do different pairings like this. So I really enjoyed taking this really broad theme and seeing how we could apply it in creative ways to our collection. So I think we definitely want to do more of that going forward. And I would love to do another show like this on something really broad, like beauty or power or something like that. But there's no definite plans for anything specific, but there's definitely an interest going forward.
Well, if anybody has any more questions, now's your last chance. Yeah, you can just drop it in the chat. Well, if no one has any other questions, we're ending a little bit early, but that's okay. I guess this concludes this virtual lunchtime lecture. Thank you all for joining the NCMA's lecture, Creating Reflections on Light, featuring Michele Frederick, the NCMA's Curator of European Art. Thank you so much, Michele, for this fascinating lecture and insight into this exhibition. I personally can't wait to see it in person. It looks so great.
Thank you.
We also want to remind you all that the North Carolina Museum of Art is now open. Please note that the museum's new hours and safety measures on the NCMA website. During your visit, you can view the Reflections of Light exhibition in person. So we invite you to do so. And we appreciate your support of our virtual programs. And if you would like to continue to support the NC Museum of Art, we ask you to consider becoming a member of the museum or making a donation to the NCMA Arts Fund. And if you're interested in becoming a member, would like to make a donation, you can visit our website. And thank you all again. We hope you enjoyed the lecture and look forward to having you at our upcoming virtual events. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.